Here to talk through this Yajilin by Sam Cappleman-Lynes called Open Middle. And as we've done with the rest of this week, we will eventually get to a speed solve of me doing the Sunday Stumper blind on paper, but I wanted to talk a little bit through the logic of this puzzle first and what we're going to be watching during the solve. This puzzle has a set of standard Yajilin looking clues, and some places if you go down the normal path, you may make some of these first notations, these corner cells quickly placed. The open middle gives us all of those white cells. These two ones that point in the same direction give us this channel. And then you might start to think, well, we have these almost constrained clues, like this 4 to the right, that have as many as 2 over here, as many as 3 over here, so there's 1 degree of freedom left, and knowing if there are 2 to the left or 1 to the left will force 2 to the right or 3 to the right, so that can help. This 3 has only so many spaces for cells to get in, and it has to work with a 1 up above, so we have to get 4 shaded cells in these blocks. And those are all good places to be looking. They're not places, except for maybe some trial and error, you're going to make some quick progress. Or something else that's going on in this puzzle, which is one of the interesting things about Yajilin, which is if you frame the puzzle this way and focus on the clue locations themselves, when you have a lot of known white cells, this almost becomes a simple loop puzzle. And so there is a catalytic core to this puzzle, which is really the center of the open middle. I've colored it in this way in blue and in green. And a thing to note about it is that this is effectively a bounded square based on this clue to the right and this clue to the left of these cells in blue. Notice that if this set, let me go to the loop drawing mode that I wanted to have. If this set closes this way in a simple loop sense by going up and right, it isolates this blue cell. And what that means is that this needs to have one end coming down here and one end coming up here. Now we're in a case where if this green comes up this way, this blue end and this blue end both want to come into it. So not only do we have to have ends coming into these blue cells, we need to not have ends coming from these spaces. And what that does is now allows us to know that we have to corner quickly here. That works with the corner you already have in the grid in this way. Notice now a cell like this has some tension to it. It needs to have two ends that come to it. So let's look at a case like this cell. If the cell went left and up, it's not going to leave space for that. So from a simple loop type logic, this has to go to the right. Same thinking now for this cell, also needs to take one of these ends. So this cell here can't just go up and right, down and right. It has to take one end left. And you do the same thing then for this cell. This can't be up and right because that's just going to circle back and cause the same issue here. And so this can't be both up and right. This has to be left and then up or right. And so you get all these ends you can draw in. There's actually a little more you can do on both sides of the grid, but the top and bottom effectively have the same kind of logic to them. And where the top has almost all of it drawn in, you can do the same down in the bottom and get to a point that's kind of like this. And now is when coming back to Yajilin thinking may be a useful thing to do. And I've got two kinds of logical steps which are important at this stage of the puzzle. Again, we've done a lot of simple loop in the middle. We now have, like in these cells in red, 4 loop ends. And so we can't take this edge because that would be putting another loop end into this and leaving just 3 behind. So this has to come down. And this forms a corner cell in the grid, which is going to place a key limitation on this cell for the 2 down clue, which we'll get to next. On the upper right, we have still an even count of ends. I've shaded them all in, but we have 8 in green, and that means I can't take this cell. So this now is a group of 4. That again now places a limit here, and these have to come and connect. And so we're still doing now end counting, not yet really Yajilin shading, but we're still thinking about loop properties as we make this headway. So with all that in the grid, now how do we get to the key break-in points? Well, we'll come back to that first thing I said at the start, which is that at some stage of this puzzle, looking at this 4 to the right and the 1 to the right and the 3 to the right has to eventually matter. And this is a moment where we can now think about what is possible to place 2 clues in from this 4 right clue over here. If it took these 2 cells in pink, you'd have to draw a loop section through here, and then you would have to shade in this cell. But as we said from the Yajilin constraints, if you shade this, now that you actually have this part of the loop drawn in, you make a cell that can only be reached once. And so this is marked off, which means you can't take both of these cells because you would not leave enough space for that 2 to work. So instead, you only take one of these, and you have to take 3 cells over to the right. That quickly forces this cell. You'll see that you actually can't have this pattern of shaded cells because you can't fill in the bottom and still get one end coming across. So all you know is you have a cell here and this shaded. And you can follow that a little further along. Recognize that then the loop end counts crossing down into the bottom rows need this cell to the right. marking in all the loops from it and making this one right clue take the last position for it, you get to this stage of the puzzle. And now we have these two pink ends that finally can interact with this 3 right clue and give us a lot of quick reasoning. One thing you'll often think about when you've got a loop end near a place you're shading is that these diagonally adjacent cells are pretty key. Like imagine I shaded this cell, then this loop is going to have to come this way, but it's also forced to come this way. So this first pink cell isn't usable. And similar limitations around this one. In this case, this loop end is going to have to come to the right if this gets shaded. And then these loop ends don't want to touch, but both of these get marked off. And so we would have this cell shaded, but now we need to take 1, 2, 3 more, but those 3 don't work to fill out. So this cell and this cell are canceled. That forces the shaded cell here, here, and then in one of these. And those steps get us to the next sticking point of the puzzle, which is we've now marked that in. We have an either or. And now we have to make this one right clue work. And this is an interesting case where, and I think we highlighted some of this earlier in the week, we have 2 states of the world. Notice that there's a case where the red cell is to the right here and the blue cell's to the left here for this 3 right clue. You can't have this blue to the left and take this cell as well. So if this is shaded, the 1 right clue up above needs to take this one in blue. So these get shaded together and they're a knight's move apart. You'll see if this in red is shaded, you can't shade this one. And so instead you shade this one over here, which is a knight's move apart. And so 2 of these shaded cells for sure come together. The thing to note about them, and let me draw this maybe in a color like gray, is across these positions, I always have a line segment coming down here and like so. Across these positions, I'll always have a line segment going here, and there's even something further. If I look at blue, blue always draws in this line segment, and I look at red, red has something like this that also draws in this line segment. And so this line segment is key because it now moves this line segment in. So we're still looking across a 2-state world. We don't know which of these it is, but as we keep drawing in these lines, we now see that this blue being shaded is bad because it forces you to take this end and you can't close off a loop. So instead blue is white, red is shaded, and you get out to this stage, and just keeping all these loop ends connecting gets us to this part of the puzzle. And so the right side's all finished, and we've now got to think about the left. The star in the left is, again, now seeing we've got just 1 clue from this 4 left clue, and there are a lot of symmetric clues here, like this 3 left is the same, this 4 left is the same as what we saw down below to the right side. So once we know there's 1 over here, we've got to place 3 shaded cells here, and 2 of them can be placed straight away. Those are in this cell and this cell, and then an either or here as we figure out the rest of the grid. The more key interactions there will be ones we haven't looked at yet, which are this 3 left clue and this 2 down clue and this 4 right clue that all work together in this colored mess that I've put together. So where do these colors start from? The colors start first from recognizing I can't shade both of these in red because then I'm going to come through this channel with this 2 down clue and I can't put 2 shaded cells down here. So only one of these in red is shaded. I get another clue here and another clue here. The next thing to think through with that is with one of those 2 shaded, I can't shade both of these, so I have to shade one of these in purple. That's where this X clue is marked in. But notice in shading one of these in purple, I can't then also shade this cell right here. If I shade this cell, I shade this cell, I come across this set, and this 4 right clue is never fulfilled. So I know I've got one of these shaded, and I know I have to shade exactly this, and so shading this cell is the next step I was able to make in my grid. That gets me to this kind of position. Still with the same thinking, and again, we were talking about how we had an either or choice with this 3 left clue. The more forcing version of these is often packing them all to the far side. Notice we're starting to isolate this quadrant of the grid, this corner of the grid a bit. If all 3 of these in green get shaded, I have to now take all of these 5 cells in blue, but with a loop path coming up here, and wanting to turn here, but also wanting to turn here. Notice I've got 2 ends coming up, and I've got to take 3 cells immediately off of those 2 ends. I have a parity issue. And so this cell can't be shaded. I have to actually relax the constraint by shading one further out and then going back to the space. And so marking this cell in is a key part of the logical path. That now forces a lot of these loop ends up. You'll notice these loop ends are the same loop ends, so this will chase around the grid, and we get a lot of these connecting. We now have these loop ends that don't want to join in orange, so we can't take this top position. We got to take this bottom position. It's pretty standard Yajilin. We also now have a loop end that's going to come through the top, and we need to have just a single end coming through there, so we can mark in these kinds of positions. And then some last placements for these 3 left clues we've had for a while lets us finish the loop. So that's the whole logical path for this really amazing solve. It's a super tough puzzle, so let's see how long it actually took me to do on paper as we go through this video. It was originally a 5-star puzzle, so that it got posted on the web as a 4.5-star puzzle suggests that this is a little bit easier, but still probably a 10+ minute solve. So let's see how I go about this, where in a speed solving mode I follow the logical path I was just showing you through a lot of subtle steps, or where I was powering some of the external clues. I focus on the open middle first. I'm now seeing there's something about 4 of the 1 or 2 going over there. Finally just getting to the useless corners. Well, I guess they end up being useless. You were excited to make the progress first. On paper, I do make these 3 long stretches. They're not as helpful in the real notation because they're not very forcing immediately, but they just give me a sense of the constraints as I'm looking around the grid. I have the same 1-2 constraint on the 4 left, so I'm seeing some of the symmetry in the puzzle in my notations. I finally note the 1 down column I can make because of those adjacent clues. I mark off that cell because it's near corners, so starting to limit the 3 to the right, so I'm looking a lot, I think, at the 3 to the right clue at this space. I might now be looking at the 4 to the right and seeing, are there ways to place 3 cells in that row? And now finally coming back and seeing the simple loop step, and the first thing I do is mark off one of those edges is not useful. I don't actually catch the fact I have a 2x2 square that needs to have 4 ends come into it, but now I get to there. So I did this backwards in the logical solving path, but seeing that loop constraint. This very interesting property of this grid is the next thing I do, and getting some of these loop ends in. I'm now doing some of the simple loop thinking. Let's see if I'm actually pretty good at tracking this. Normally go to the next open dot and see how those break and get those all marked in. So that all looks good. I now have to be a little careful with the overall loop counting to get the critical ends. And I think it's resolved by doing the top first, which is how I had it marked in the other puzzle. But I'm coming back to these 3 right, 1 right clues, trying to make some progress 2 minutes in, and you're still like looking for any real shaded cells. So there I'm actually like sketching in what would it be if all the 3s were to the right. It looks like there is an observation I was making that would cause an issue with the overall pack of the grid. It looks like there's no place for the 1 right clue if I don't take that first cell in the 3 right. So this is a deep assumption. It's not even a bifurcation, but it's saying 3s all the way to the right force that single cell in. So it is something that solvers may have run into. There's then now going to be, I think, a little more forcing with that 1 right clue because of how it may interact with the other positions that can get shaded for the 3 right clue. But we'll see where I go to next. I'm now finally tracking through the symmetry that I can do some of the same simple loop at the top. This is where it's often good to pause and step back for a moment and just recognize the kinds of progress you've made elsewhere in a fairly symmetric grid may actually work on the other side of the grid. I still have some dots I really want to be marking lines in, but looks like I'm now cleaning up my notation because I have more that's a little bit forced. I'm trying to do some tests to see if there are other cells with the 1 right clue I can quickly cancel. And it looks like I might have found one. Actually, no, on to seeing, oh, there's a big path, I need a shaded cell. Some of those positions quickly force because they will form a channel what the bottom does. So that's kind of what I'm looking at, is where I know one of the 2 clues is going to quickly interact with the other clue. I'm trying to find the most limited cells and see if those cells actually not just limit to 1 path, but limit to 0 paths, and then be able to place a dot through that. Where there is a whole lot of openness still at that side of that grid, that's not a productive place to look, and the better thing to do will be to track more about these ends in the grid if I get back to thinking that way. Looks like I've made some rationalization that I can't have a 2 on the right side with that 4 left clue. And just looking at it now, what that looks like it does is it's going to quickly force the loop ends to the top. That's going to put a lot of constraints on the 1 right, 3 right space, and there may or may not be a way to fill that in. So without kind of pausing and rechecking here, I can't exactly see what the logic was there, but it looks like it's either a deep assertion that was visualized, or something about maybe the loop ends even at the top. Like I still haven't marked the simple loop steps as well at the top there, but there is something forcing on the 4 left that came through there. And now at the bottom coming together, I actually have that I have these 2 loop ends with a single domino left over, so those will join. That's now forcing these pieces. It's forcing that step up. I now go to some of those diagonally adjacent cells I was marking off, both of those diagonally around the other clue. I was seeing are pretty limiting, so I get the first shaded cell in. Now I need to fill in the last of that shaded cells, and so I'm going to see, am I working from the 1 right clue first or the 3 right clue first? It looks like I'm still working across these options. So I see I can't take that cell. I'm now to that either or choice I was talking about. That's going to limit how the blue can't go right above it. Because the loop end issues, the blue can't go right to the left of that clue either, so that's the next one I should be marking in. As we went in the video, this may be where I will check one of the paths. So I'm looking now actually across not just the 1 right clue, but also how that 4 left is going to take a cell. And I didn't do that in my PenPy edit sort of logical video stretch, but I'm now very much visualizing, looks like the path of the loop around the space. I'm seeing that there is a broken path in one of the ways and an okay path in the other way. So I now have intercepted what I found logically by a better blue-red kind of shading, but you often are doing the same kind of thinking and speed solving of looking at potential loops and where they break. I've got these loop ends that need to not join. Got this connection. So now I'm going to have to come back to the left side of the grid with kinds of steps like we've done before. And we'll see if I start with that 4 left clue or if I actually work around the 4 right and the 2 down that we know interact. I actually have the key dot at the bottom of that 2 down column already marked, so some space of how these loop ends go is going to come through pretty quickly. I still have one note I've got to mark in, which is about this line segment, which will help me. Again, I have 4 loop ends here, and so this 5th one can't come into that space. So we'll see if I get that, or actually, I'm looking, okay, so I see I can't take both of these because of blocking off the 4, so I've marked that shaded cell in. I now get those 2 notes across. I get this X coming across. It's easier to show that on paper. There's that down segment. Here's that X again. Now cleaning up some of the space. So we're hitting a lot of the steps are actually through the logical solve I saw. Again, in some of these cases, I'm either doing a deep check or finding something that's not otherwise in what I'd prepared. So, when you solve for speed, you're often trying to sketch what has to happen and learn from trial. When you really are stumped, and you can see my head's a little off screen, but I'm totally grabbing my forehead and thinking hard right now. I now have that loop end on the bottom, which should help me see how the 4 right path works with the 2 down path. Though it may be key to actually work out that 3 left first. So I'm seeing that is bad. There we are, so get that. That now does connect these loop ends in a way that I'm going to be able to use quite quickly. So this should now break apart rather fast. Almost 9 minutes in. Let's see if we break the 10-minute barrier. It looks a little bit close to see if that's going to be possible on this Sunday Stumper. Got to get those loop ends in this corner, got to get them up to the top. I've not actually tracked the 4 left clue perfectly, which has to have this open pattern, but it looks like I'm now getting it. The other shaded cell should be faster. Yeah, there we are. Still have to mark which of those it is, and it can't be the one on the right, so it's the one on the left. 9:25, 30 seconds for the 10-minute barrier. I need to get these loop ends to dodge at the top. I need to not have those come together. Need to have the other shaded cell on the left side, so these loop ends stay apart. These are now coming down, 9:42. I need to make all the clues work. That 2 left works with the domino, and there we go, just in time. So If you're wondering how a grandmaster did this puzzle in 10 minutes, this was a video of doing that, and my own speculation was maybe this is a little easier. We've had some Sunday Stumpers that take me even 30 plus minutes up to an hour, and so we did actually edit this difficulty down to 4.5 stars, but it's a really elegant Yajilin, so thanks Sam for the great puzzle. Hopefully you got a sense of how to think through simple loop type steps in working through these grids. That was very key for the start, not the typical Yajilin steps, but just drawing these loop end bits and then working through different elements of the forcings in the grid using the symmetric clues, the 4 right, 4 left, and other things that we showed. So thanks for watching this whole video, and we'll see you again soon.